One of the most difficult things to be prepared for and willing to do is change. It requires a complete, abject acceptance of what is. And in order to see what is, we must be able to detach ourselves from what it is that we might like things to be. In the time of the Roman Emperor Maurice, he saw great precedent to author himself or to delegate the task to one of his supreme commanders, an experienced officer of men, to compose the Strategikon, a military doctrine handbook meant to guide those participants of the military institution back to their disciplined roots. At this point in time, it has been roughly nearly 2 centuries since the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire, and even since then, the Romans endured much in the way of strife, change, and difficulty. The drill-heavy, infantry-dominant legions of the Republic and of the early Empire were no longer sufficient, nor were they as economically feasible to maintain and deploy as they had been in the days of yore. And many Romans, those in the aristocracy, and those members of the army who found themselves increasingly disconnected from the institution of the past, was unaware as to how to galvanize their soldiers, arrange the levies, and cope with modern tactical problems. The perspective offered by the Strategikon begins to frame the mind that is prepared to accept change and to begin to initiate change. The Romans, in their heyday, though they looked back at themselves, seeking to emulate and to repeat a genius formula, are unaware that those men at that time themselves were innovators. Everything is always constantly changing. Everything is always timeless. It is against our wants, it is against our desires, but it's inevitable. You see, in the times of Caesar, in the times of the Republic, the Roman army was a state-funded, well-oiled, well-drilled machine of heavy infantry. In the instances of Gaul or other theaters, typically the Romans were focused with one entry point into enemy territory, and it would be easier for them to reliably fund it, reliably supply it, and field it. These Romans were not going up against hegemonic federations that existed for hundreds of years at a time. They were going up against disparate tribal people who had yet to truly organize themselves, the central authority, and therefore coordinate resources beyond a aristocratic minority, oligarchical minority, and a mass of impoverished and indeterminate poor who were largely slaves to those who were superior to them in economic status, as it pertains to Gaul. These conditions would not last forever, right? As the Western Roman Empire and as the Roman Empire itself went on, its enemies would exist in its periphery. And as the centuries went on, they would invariably begin to adopt some of their tactics, even in the short term. When Quintus Cicero was besieged in 54 BC by the Nervii tribe, using both captives and exposure to Roman siege tactics, they encircled his entire winter quarters with improvised siege works. Watchtowers, walls, earthworks, completely barricading and surpassing in height the defenses of their compound. That's even in the short term. Project that over the course of hundreds of years, and we begin to see the confederations of German states that have consolidated their resource management, and they've begun to field heavy armor, better equipment at a higher volume for people other than those conflated to a small population at the economic top. Now, more soldiers enjoyed reliable equipment. Equipment such as this now permeates itself to more complex tactics. Rome is now no longer going up against those who can very rarely maintain a prolonged head-to-head formation fight, right? The Romans are up against those who need to outsmart them in the opening salvos of the battle. They're up against those who need to, in fell swoops, constrict their supply line, remove reinforcements, and defeat the enemy quickly to instill fear, shock, and terror in order to dislodge the Roman ranks and permit the slaughter, such as was observed with the legate Sabinus in 54 BC against the Treveri tribes. A psychological battle. Now this is changing, right? The metallurgy, the consolidation, the wealth of these peripheral nations is now on par with Rome's. And due to Rome's expansion, ending with Trajan, diagnosed by Hadrian, it's becoming too expensive to maintain. Now the armies of the old days, the legions of the old days are beginning to change. They're not these things that are levied and moved around to put out a fire over here and put out a fire over there, because as these peripheral nations are consolidating, increasing their threat capacity, the fires are everywhere, right? It now is becoming unmanageable to levy legions here, move them over here. Now there's a new problem over there, and it becomes chaotic. Legions begin to become stationary, right? The 12th legion levied by Caesar for Gaul in 59 BC would be stationed for 400 years, guarding the crossing of the Euphrates River from the Sassanid and Parthian Persians. That would be their legion headquarters. That is where they would remain. And such would become the case of many legions. They would become stationary headquarters so as to not create space for fires to engulf regions abandoned by a mobile army. As time continues to drag on, the deployment of these legions in their standard fashion is now becoming ineffective. If you deploy a slow-moving, heavy infantry focused army out into the open plains of the east, which the Romans largely avoided doing and struggled at succeeding with whenever they would go into forays in the east, their tactics were no match for the Easterners. And why? Why was that? Right? Well, these were not necessarily disparate tribal people competing for supplies and unable to, amongst themselves, coordinate a functioning, federation. But Parthia was an imperial entity. And so it had been able to focus economic prowess and resources to field highly expensive heavy cavalry cataphracts, mounted horse archers, highly mobile, and the Roman tactical solution is completely redundant. You now have fast-moving projectile volleys coming towards and away from your forces, unable to give them a proper confrontation, which is where the Romans succeed, right? Endure the initial shock of the blow, rely on institutionalized discipline and focus to coordinate through the chaos, and once the enemy's momentum has ceased, terminate them. But no such opportunity presents itself here. Now drawn out and back and out and back, by these mounted archers, heavy cataphracts now come in. What precedent is there to deal with a cavalry contingent like this? Heavily armored, heavily equipped, fast-moving, shock cavalry, smashing through the ranks. And so the Romans are defeated in their blocks piecemeal. The Germans began to adopt similar tactics. They deployed heavily armored infantry and heavily armored horsemen. You can see it in the Roman helmets that would be produced in the times that the Germans began to advance themselves, like the Niederberber, I believe it is, fitted with these heavy brows and reinforced spines on the helmets in order to endure blows from high-mounted German riders, heavily armored, bearing down on them. So this slow-moving tactical block is progressively failing to deal with tactical problems. We also now have the settlement of new peoples deploying tactics before unknown, right? The Alans, the Slavs. So we need to change. And how can people in an institution this large begin to prepare themselves for change? And what are they forgetting? Right? The fidelity of the military machine is fading. It's been 2 centuries since the West has fallen, and it's been wars ever since to secure the stability of the East. And just when Emperor Maurice thinks he's been able to deal with some of these problems, more are born. The Bulgars bear in. The Slavs are coming. So how can we diagnose this? What does that look like? And that's what this book represents. It came at a time to urge and galvanize passivity in the institution of the army, to abandon these ridiculous notions of achieving victories like had once been done before. The devastating economic losses, the stature of the empire was not what it used to be. And even if it was, fielding an army that size in that modern economic framework was completely unnecessary, as it would fail and was failing to secure the sovereignty of the Roman people. So the perspective we can begin to glean off of it is there's nothing waiting for you in the past. You should not be envious of something that cannot exist in the present day. You must adapt. That is the laws of nature. That is the laws of the world. You must deal with what is. Because the truth is, you don't know what was. In the Romantic revival, in the rediscovery of the ancients, the Renaissance paintings, look at how the Romans are depicted. Right? It's sort of antithetical, if that's the right word. It's not accurate, right? But they had a exposure to what they believed the Romans looked like based on what they had found at the time, based on what was on Trajan's column. And so that's how the Romans were in their brains, in their minds. We look at the time of Caesar's soldiers. We look at their armor. Well, it's very likely the Romans innovated some of their equipment from the very Gauls that they were at war with, right? It's an adoption, an innovation. It's always happening. And the things that you perceive to be just one thing are actually a mix of many others, right? And so the glory days of old, the Roman way is hardly the Roman way, right? It is always the ability to adapt new strategies and deal with the new and present reality. It is disconcerting. It's counter to ego and pride, right? It was a hard pill to swallow to say, you know what, guys, the old days are done. Right? The legions of old, the way that we used to do things, it's not going to happen. It's just not happening. We need to come up with something new, and we need to do it now. And for the mistakes that we're making, right, what's part of the reason why the days of old aren't possible? It's because the institution of the army has suffered so much that people are now making grave tactical mistakes. And this handbook is meant to inform and advise those soldiers and those officers and those commanders so as to reinvigorate the institution, the tradition, the doctrine. And that is something we must do in our lives. Right? We must be able to diagnose what is not working. And we must be able to deal with reality, not envy, not with the wanton of the heart and the mind, this longing for glory of old, these things that, can you reach into that and hold it in your hands? No, you can't. And there was a great deal of effort that had to have been had to reinstate an effective army. They had to counter this sort of passivity, this sort of pining in the minds of the elites and those who possessed influence. They had to counter this. Imagine that you have to convince people to deal with reality. And of course, people don't want to do that. Of course, that is a disconcerting process. But from something so simple as a doctrine, handbook, meant to be relied upon and drawn from by military officers, the perspective of people in time, can we begin to gain an understanding of what it is we must do in our own life. It is just another avenue where it is expressed, where the evidence reveals itself once again. You have to be willing to change. You have to be willing to see what's not working. And you have to confront it. It is an active, innovative, adaptive, experience. It is not necessarily fun. Right? Is what is now the same as what was? No. No. Is it perfectly comparable? Probably not. But we only have what is, and what is must be working. Right? What is must be producing the things that each of us individually determines is necessary for us. So take some perspective from these long-reigning individuals, right? Where, of course, the morality cannot be easily discerned, but there is a tact. There is a practicality that we can bring back with us. For we are in a moral dilemma. And much the same as them, we do contend with a real and material world. So think, try to be the Roman commander. Try to be deliberate. Because in the audit of so many things, in the thoroughness of the ambition of your life, that skill will be invaluable.